Excellent. So thank you all for joining us today. So as people are getting signed in, I'm just going to walk through some technical details about the webinar technology we're using and share a little bit more about what you're seeing on your screen here. So if you are connected to the webinar and are dialed in listening to the meeting audio using your telephone, you'll likely want to mute your computer speakers to avoid getting some feedback and an echo. And we are going to be showing some slides, showing a little video at the end of the webinar, and using some webinar polling features. So if you're listening in and haven't joined the webinar portion yet, doing so will just really let you fully participate and follow along a bit better. The webinar technology we're using here is Adobe Connect Pro, and the link to access and log in should be in the registration confirmation email you received. All of the audio lines are currently muted to keep background noise down, but you can mute and unmute your own audio line by pressing *6 on your telephone keypad. And you can also do it if you're connected to the web. You can mute and unmute your computer speakers too, and your computer microphone. So if you're connected to the web portion of the meeting, and aren't dialed in but are listening through your computer speakers, you can use the chat box down on the bottom left-hand side of your screen to share any questions. If you're connected for the telephone, you can use the *6 to mute and unmute and to verbally ask questions. But for those on the audio line, you can also use the chat. So we can test out the chat feature right now if you'd like. So you can use that chat box just to introduce yourself to others on the webinar. It's on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, so you can just type what you'd like to share with everyone in the bottom white bar, and you can either hit enter or click on the little talking bubble icon, and that will send your message. We are going to have some time for questions, and you're welcome to use this chat feature throughout the entire presentation. Above the chat is where the presentation slides will be displayed. So right now you should be seeing a welcome slide. To the right of that welcome slide is a picture of our presenter today, Geri Wisner, who is going to be talking with you all throughout the webinar. And I'm going to turn things over to her in just a minute. Below Geri is the attendee list. And you will be able to look through that to see who else is connected, and who else is on today. And you can also start a private chat message with me by clicking on my name in the attendee list and sending me a message if you have any technical questions or need help. And you can also chat with others on the webinar by selecting their name from that attendee list. The private chat will show up as a separate tab on the bottom left chat box. And the last thing on your screen that you should be seeing are just some reminders for things that I shared. And if you're not seeing any of this and believe you are logged into the webinar room, please just be sure you refer to the correct email registration. The webinar registration for the one we have coming up in January on domestic minor sex trafficking looks almost identical, so it's easy to get them mixed up. And if you're on the phone and are having any trouble connecting to the webinar room, some common problems I've seen when folks are trying to log in is when they're using the Google Chrome web browser or the new Windows browser. So if you're listening and have been doing either of those things, I just suggest first making sure you're using the correct webinar link and then trying to log into the meeting using a different web browser such as Mozilla Firefox or Internet Explorer. And finally, we are recording the webinar and we'll be posting the recording to our website, which is the Tribal Information Exchange, and I'll put a link to that website in the chat box for you all too. And so now I am just super excited to introduce today's presenter, Geri Wisner. Geri is an advisor to us here at the Capacity Building Center for Tribes and is also the executive director of the Native American Children's Alliance. So, Geri, thank you so much for your time today and for joining us to talk about justice in Indian country. I'm going to turn things over to you now.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you everyone who is participating on this call. I always feel awkward in a web format because I do trainings nationally, and I like seeing people's reactions. I like seeing people's faces. And so because we don't have that opportunity at any time, as inclusive as you want to feel or want to participate in this, I would highly recommend please chat. Please take advantage of the chat box and send me messages if you have comments, if you have questions. That would help me to know that you're out there. And we're going to talk today about justice in Indian country. And we're going to start off by talking about what a broad and complex question that is. Kind of two parts. Justice in itself is complex. And then when we're talking about Indian country, that also is in itself broad and complex. So let me start off by telling you a little bit about myself. Geri Wisner, Muskogee Obanagan, Kifalan Comus. My name is Geri Wisner, and I'm Muskogee Creek from the Deer Clan, and I want to share with you that it's a good day in Indian country. I am currently sitting in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is within the jurisdiction of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and wherever you may be within or throughout the 50 states, you may just as well be sitting somewhere in Indian country. So I hope you're doing well. I am the executive director for the Native American Children's Alliance. My organization does a lot of training with tribes and child maltreatment professionals to address the inappropriate and unacceptable high rates of child abuse and child maltreatment, child sexual assault in Indian country, working with tribal professionals, with our state partners, and with the federal entities. I'm also a tribal prosecutor. I have been prosecuting in Oklahoma and in Texas for approximately 14 years, and I have a number of good experiences, a handful of bad experiences, but as probably as many as you have found, I like my job, and I think the Creator put me where I am so that I can help. So I hope that with the information that we share today, it will be able to help you. If nothing else, maybe you may walk away with a new knowledge of things. And if at any time, if you have questions, of all of my slides, I think this is the most important. It has my email information. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. If we're during the webinar, don't hesitate to send a chat question. If you would like to send me a question, or if you would like to correspond, or you get 2 days or 2 weeks down the road and you find you have a question, please take advantage of my email address. One of the things that I have learned working in and throughout Indian country is it's kind of a small world. And however I can help with a situation that you know of or one that may come across your desk, please keep me in mind if there's something that I may do. And if I can't, then I will try to help find someone who can help you. All right, I need to share with you that some of my slides have copyrighted materials that I have given attribution. So if that's all to say that if I'm ever federally prosecuted, it's going to be something that's going to be a lot sexier than copyright infringement. All right, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about Indian country, but specifically, we're going to talk about what is justice and the various aspects of justice in Indian country. We're going to examine congressional authority, which is also known as congressional plenary authority, and its influence on tribal law. We're going to talk about the status of tribal codes and laws, and then we're going to talk about strategies to maintain customs and traditions within the tribe and the tribal justice systems. Okay. So there's our roadmap for what we're going to do for the next 80 minutes now. So here we go. I think it's important that we start off by talking about terminology. As I started off saying, I'm Muskogee Creek, but I'm Indian in accordance with the federal codes and how they're written, because they define Indians and Indian country. In today's society, depending on the company you may be, appropriately addressed can be Native American or American Indian. Some tribal members and indigenous people prefer being referred to as indigenous, and some prefer to be called by their tribal affiliation. And in any situation such as that, I would recommend, as I work with a lot of forensic interviewers, and they start off by saying, well, how would you prefer what would you prefer that I call you? And we're using the term Indian in this because of the federal codes. We have the federal Indian law definitions. We have the Indian Child Welfare Act. So we're going to use the term Indian, and I may say Native American or American Indian or a tribe. I just want to give the caveat that I am likely to use them synonymously, but making an understanding that that's what I'm referring to. Indian country is also named and enumerated through various federal codes. We'll talk about them because there are differences, just as there are differences on who's Indian, what's Indian. So we'll get into that a little bit further. But when I say Indian country, there is designated land that did or does belong to federally recognized tribes. And we'll get into why am I saying federally recognized tribes as opposed to tribes. We'll come up on that a little bit later. But federally recognized tribes, for the purpose of this presentation, will be the 567 nations and tribes within the United States. That comes to our next terminology clarification. Some tribes will call themselves a tribe, and some are define themselves as a nation. I use those synonymously, and they are used synonymously throughout the country. I will take my tribe. The Muskogee Creek Nation is our formal name. And there is also, for example, if I take the Tulalip tribe out of Washington State, their formal name is the Tulalip tribe. So if I happen to say tribe or nation or even community, I want to throw in community just in recognition of the Urban Removal Act, where during the 1960s, 1970s, there were several tribal members who were removed from their tribal lands or reservations and placed in urban areas, New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles. So I want to put that in there. So if I do say a tribal community, it may not necessarily be tribal land where they are, but relocated, and therefore a high concentration of tribal members or of Indian people. I know that Minnesota, the urban areas in Minnesota, they have a lot of Native people there in the tribal community, although it's not officially tribal land. Then the last terminology that I want to talk about is codes and laws. I will use those synonymously. When I talk about codes, I will use that in reference to tribal speak. So when we talk about our tribal codes, it's just a set of laws. So I will use the word tribal codes, tribal laws synonymously. So if anybody has any questions, or if I'm not making myself clear through the presentation, please send me a note, send me a message in the chat box, and I'll be happy to address that. All right, let's talk about justice. The Black's Law Dictionary says that justice is just behavior or treatment, and it's also a concern for justice, peace, and a genuine respect for people. I think that I like the second definition in that it's peace and a genuine respect for people. However, that doesn't necessarily fit what we often hear if, say, we're watching the news We see it, and many times, especially here recently, in the recent years, social unrest. And you'll hear people, as they're protesting, no justice, no peace. So how does this fit in the context, and what do they mean when they say no justice, no peace? So in that context, what does justice really mean? As a prosecutor, I have had family members, and the one specific case I can think of, I had a father in my office whose 14-year-old daughter was sending nude pictures of herself to her boyfriend, who happened to be 25 years old. And he found the pictures and was very upset. He came to my office and he had officers with him, and he wanted justice. He felt that it was very unfair. He felt that she had been preyed upon. And although it may be true, there is also a sense of justice that under those circumstances, while his daughter took the pictures and she had the pictures and she sent the pictures, legally speaking, and looking at if it's justice as the law, I'm looking at charging his daughter for the manufacture, possession, and distribution of child porn. Now, that's not at all what, I know that's not what he thought of when he was saying, I want justice. But it's also important to point out when we talk about this whole bigger scope of justice and what is justice, and when specifically we're talking about justice in Indian country, what that is. Okay, I see a question. Will there be an opportunity to download the PowerPoint? Laura, are you there? Can you help us out, or do you have any answers so we could address that?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're okay with it, I'm happy to post the PowerPoint with the recording of today's webinar on our Tribal Information Exchange, and we can let people know when that's posted.
Okay, that'll be fine. Thank you. All right. Now, the question is then bears. Is justice different in Indian country? I think that it's important, and I have the citation here for ex parte crow dogs. Now, in crow dogs, that was one of the early decisions that was brought to the Supreme Court, 1883, not the earliest. But it was an early decision that looked at justice within a tribe. So in the 1830s, 1830 through 1835, there were 3 cases that basically are the canons of construction. Here's my legal term for the day. The canons of construction that set out what is Indian country and how the United States was going to deal with Indian country. I say that, and there are still cases that come out and define this, but in 1883, we had ex parte Crow Dog. Crow Dog was a member of the Brule Sioux Lakota tribe. He shot and killed Spotted Tail, another member of his tribe. Now, the background story says that Spotted Tail was trying to, he was working closely with the U.S. government. And for a fee, he would basically trick his tribe onto reservation land because they were moving, they were trying to stay away from the U.S. government. They didn't want to be restricted or contained within a reservation. So they were doing pretty well until Spotted Tail had tricked his people onto the reservation, where he then received a monetary supplement. He got paid for it, and in the process, he made some pretty good friends with the surrounding non-Indian community and with the U.S. government. According to the Brule tribe tradition, basically being a traitor to your people and committing treason, he was killed by Crow Dog. Then, following the traditional law, Crow Dog basically took the place of Spotted Tail in his family. So he had to support Spotted Tail's wives, he had to support Spotted Tail's children, and any other obligations he had, Spotted Tail had, Crow Dog had to take them on. Now, in doing so, the outside community heard of what had happened, and they saw Crow Dog walking around, and they were very upset. And so the U.S. government then, they held, the U.S. authorities then prosecuted Crow Dog for the murder of Spotted Tail. He was found guilty, and he was sentenced to hang. The Supreme Court, it was appealed to the Supreme Court, who found that federal courts, at that time, federal courts had no jurisdiction to try cases where the offense had already been tried by the tribal council. And as I explained earlier, the tribal council had already dealt with it. I want to share this, that tribes have had a sense of justice and have had some structure of law enforcement or of rules and authority enforcement since the beginning of time. Now, tribes are also oral traditional people. Our laws, our history, who we are, is all carried down by our oral traditionalists within each tribe. So in this situation, the Supreme Court said that tribal law had already been executed, had already been administered, and the federal government had no jurisdiction to jump into the affairs of the tribe. Now, with that being said, here comes the issuance of congressional plenary power. Congressional plenary power is found to say that Congress has the plenary power to step in and make rules over tribes and the tribal businesses. So in this situation, because they didn't like the decision of the Supreme Court, the Congress then passed the Major Crimes Act. The Major Crimes Act basically says that if there are certain crimes that are committed, murder, rape, assault, and there are several more, if those crimes are committed between Indians on Indian land, that would be covered by the Major Crimes Act, and the federal government would then have jurisdiction to try those cases. Now, that also did trickle down. There is the General Indian Crimes Act, and there are several others that Congress has passed. But you can find the congressional plenary authority in Clause 3, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. And in that, where it says, Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce between the states and with Indian tribes. So through that little provision, there are a number of things that spring forth the Commerce Clause, and essentially where Congress has set aside their plenary authority, where they can make all kinds of decisions over Indian tribes. I say all kinds of decisions. That also includes the termination authority. Through up and until Nixon's administration, there were several tribes who were essentially terminated. Congress, by the mighty mark of a pen, had terminated several tribes who are now still, many of them have, but there are some who are still trying to gain their federal recognition, who during the termination era were previously terminated. So is justice in Indian country different? Yes. Each tribe has their own set of laws. Each tribe has that goes with the unique identity of each tribe. We have 566 or 567 federally recognized tribes in the United States. Each of them have a unique history, origin stories, their laws, their language, their songs, their ceremonies. So I want to say that so that if you are working in or around Indian country, that there's no confusion with the fact that there is really no pan-Indian. There's no real pan-Indian. So recognizing that each of them are unique and different with their own government and structure, be it a president, of the tribe or a chief of the tribe or a governor. Those are all often used synonymously, and each tribe may be different. So I would recommend looking to the tribe that you're working with to determine what is their governmental structure and how do you address their governmental administration. Do they have a business council? Do they have just a general council, or what is their structure? Each of them are different, and they are also run differently by each of their constitutions. So why are we talking about Indians and Indian country? Well, I think we've had a little bit of, we have our poll. So if you can take just a second and take a look, how many of you have experience working with tribal communities? So that kind of goes with, kind of gives me an idea about how to talk about this. Many of you, if all of you are from tribal communities, that makes it easy. And but it's important to know that some people have not. And so I appreciate that. Somewhat experience looks like we've got someone, and we do have some that this is their first introduction. So thank you. I'll say that one. Thank you for being a part of this, and I'm hoping that all of this will be relevant and helpful to your profession. And again, for some of you who have said that you're very experienced, I would ask of you, if you have any experiences that are relevant in what we're talking about, please let us know. So why are we talking about Indians and Indian country? Well, first of all, they are enumerated within the Constitution. And so it kind of starts from there. The fact that Natives and Indians and indigenous people are indigenous to the United States, that's a good starting point. So what makes Indian country unique? The fact that it is contemporary. We're talking about things that are now. This affects us now, although we have a history that goes back to time immemorial. We also have issues that are affecting us now, separate and apart from the Black community, from the Latino community, or from the Lions Club or the Boy Scouts. So we have a contemporary history, we have contemporary issues, and we are a separate and apart legal status. I also want to toss this out here so that, not to confuse, but being Indian is a political status, and it's not a race. So I'm Muskogee Creek. I could go down to the enrollment office of my tribe and disenroll myself. And at that point, once I am disenrolled and I'm no longer Muskogee Creek, if I'm not part of any other tribe, for that purpose, as I walk out of the office, I am non-native. Now, it is considered a political classification, and that has been set apart by the United States Supreme Court. Given their infinite wisdom on how they handle Indian country matters, that's a different issue to talk about at some later time. But that's one of the many reasons why Indian country is unique. And will I get to PL 280? I see Ms. King, you've asked a question. I will, when we get to that part, I will talk about how PL 280 will has an impact and how it might be affected by this. Thank you. What makes this Indian country unique? The fact that it varies significantly among the tribes. Now, this is also important to point out. At one time, they used to call the 5 tribes, previously known as the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Creek. The 5 tribes were in the southeast part of the United States. The Cherokees were the first tribe forcibly removed from their homelands and moved to Oklahoma. They called their removal from their homeland the Trail of Tears. The tribes that follow were also called, had their own Trail of Tears. Now many tribes, many tribes are not in their original homelands, and some have been moved. In Oklahoma, we have 38 federally recognized tribes. There are tribes all across the country, each of them with their own unique history and their own unique laws and ceremonies. So again, I point that out just to make sure and that we keep away from any kind of pan-Indian perspective. But sometimes there is, but I caution about moving forward or trying to build any relationship with the tribe with any kind of pan-Indian perspective. What makes Indian country unique? The fact that it accounts for who we are today. As I mentioned earlier, when I do my introduction, I mentioned who I am. It's important what clan I am from. If I were in Oklahoma, if there were other people I could see, I might mention who my tribal town and my fire and where I dance. It is important for me to discern myself because that's who I am. That's how I identify, and it accounts for who we are today. The history also spells out where we are. Why are there so many natives in Oklahoma, in California, in Alaska? And you can look at the census and then look at history, and then those account for and play a significant role into what we're doing and where everyone is. What else makes Indian country unique? And I wanted to point this out. I did take this picture in 2010 when I was in Wounded Knee. And I found this picture to be very poignant and also reflective of a lot of the sentiment between Native people and outside agencies, be it outside state agencies or federal agencies or anyone else from the outside for that matter. And if you see the flag, you will see it's flying in a manner that shows distress. And in this community, there is a lot of distress, but it's not unique there. There is a lot of distress with outside agencies throughout Indian country, which is pretty much the United States. So what makes this unique? That there are promises and obligations that have been failed. That would be treaties, obligations, follow-up on treaties, and we still see that happening now. I was thinking about the Indian, hold on just a moment, the Indian Religious Freedom Act and the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. The fact that the recent minimization and of the bear ears, the land that is considered ceremonial and sacred to many of those tribes out there. Part of the Religious Act was to be able to have access to those lands. So again, we see accountability for promises and obligations often continue to be ignored or blatantly ignored. The other promise and obligation, this is something that happened in Oklahoma when the 5 tribes were originally sent to Oklahoma. If we think about the United States, there were indigenous people all throughout the United States. So when the U.S. government took the 5 tribes and put them in Oklahoma, they were basically putting them on top of indigenous people who were already in Oklahoma. The Wichita, the Caddo, some of the Osage and the Kiowas that regularly came through Oklahoma. So it was kind of putting people on top of people and saying, this is your land. The treaties at that time when the 5 tribes were moved were that you have this land in Oklahoma that we have designated for you as long as the grasses grow and the waters flow. Well, the grass is still growing. I have to cut mine regularly. Even though this is December, it's kind of a warm one, and we still have growing grass. And the waters, well, depending where you are, they may flow a different color, and there may be some pollution, but they're still flowing. So we still see some issues with that. Just wanted to point out, I think there's a lot of resentment because of the lack of accountability for those promises and obligations. And I want to make this a side note. When working with tribal people, and I say this because I work with a lot of abused and neglected children also, in your profession, I think it is very important not to make promises you can't keep. So it's whether it is to children or whether it's to other professionals, and especially if you're trying to establish a relationship with a tribe and collaborate and network with them, making sure of you keep your word. We're only as good as our word. And if any of you have kids, and if you happen to mention to your kids, hey, if you get good grades at the end of the semester, we're going to go to Six Flags. So at the end of the semester, if we are somewhere else besides Six Flags, if they make good grades, you can't come back and say, well, I didn't say I promised. I didn't say that this was a contract. I didn't say, nope, because you are held to your word. Regardless of whether you add that or not, you're only as good as your word. So so I say that in any respect, that I think that's a good point for any kind of professional relationship, but especially with tribes and with those relationships. Recognizing that Indian country is different. I say this to a lot of my tribal professionals because sometimes we forget that, you know, if I say, you know, I have to go to the Chokiji or Hombadegetska, I'm hungry, I forget that not everybody knows what I'm talking about. And it can be colloquial, it can be local, or it could be broader use. But it's important to know that many tribes still speak their language, regardless of the boarding school eras that tried to beat the language out of Native people. Language is still very important for who we are and how we communicate. And I use this picture here of my dear friend who has walked on, Mr. Charles Tribody. There were many code talkers. I know that our relatives, the Navajo Nation code talkers, were recently honored, and I was so proud of them. But I also want to point out there were many tribes that had code talkers, and the importance of our language, and not only the importance of our language as it is cultural identity as people, but it also played a significant role in U.S. history and the contributions that has made throughout the country and throughout the world, for that matter. I also want to point out, just as a random fact, that there are more natives who serve in our United States Armed Forces per capita than any other race in the United States. I myself served 6 years in the United States Marine Corps, and I've often been asked, well, how does that feel, and is that justice? You know, going back to the theme of our presentation, is it justice when at one point in time tribal affairs used to be under the Department of War until they were set aside? And if it is, you know, a lot of people still hold indignation and bad feelings toward the United States. However, we send our young men and women to the services more than any other race. And for that, I think it's also important to know that in the sense of justice, in the beginnings of times, we were fighting, and when we had war, it was in the swamps. It was on the plains, on the backs of horses, and that's where we did our fighting. Through the 60s and the 1970s, as social justice developed and our country continued to grow, we took advantage of social protest and social involvement. And there were many different movements, the American Indian movement for one, that had a significant impact on change and how we address different peoples and changes in society. Today, we have warrior societies. Tribes have warrior societies. We have our warriors who come back wearing uniforms. We also know where to fight. And our fights now take place, for me, it's wearing high heels and a suit, carrying my briefcase to the courtroom. So if it's looking at historically, it used to be the plains and the swamps and the creeks and rivers where we would fight. to the streets, and now we have educated ourselves, and we know that the battles now are in the courtroom. What else makes us different is the fact that if you look at communication variances and communication skills, so much of our communication is our language, but the majority of it and how we truly express ourselves is through nonverbal communication. And recognizing that that's different as you are in Indian country. And a lot of people don't recognize there are little hand gestures and signals and things that you do that can be tribal specific, or it can be familial and relevant within a family. But recognizing that it's important that when working with tribal people, or if you're Native and you're working with non-tribal professionals or organizations or just people, that there may be some differences in how we conduct ourselves that may or may not be misinterpreted. For example, eye contact. A lot of, when I'm working with investigators and they will do an interrogation, sometimes they'll come back and say, you know, I just got this gut feeling he's not telling the truth. He wouldn't look at me in the eye. He was real shifty in his mannerisms. The same can be said about children if they're being interviewed in a forensic interview setting. I will also want to point out that if you're in Indian country and with many tribal people, that is a sign of respect. I don't have to look at you in the eye to be able to carry a conversation. And in avoiding the direct eye contact that you would otherwise tell someone to do in an interview or in a professional conversation, the deference of the eye contact is really considered a sign of respect, and especially respect for elders. So it's important to recognize that. The same would be true with a handshake. I learned this one myself when I came back from the Marine Corps and I was shaking hands at a powwow, and I caught myself buckling knuckles in my hands, because in regular society, if you go for an interview, it's that first impression that is the lasting impression. And they say give a good firm handshake. But in Indian country, as I'm shaking hands, I'm finding I'm buckling knuckles, and I asked my grandma, you know, am I shaking hands wrong? What am I doing? She said, yes, you've been gone too long. She's like, you know, in Indian country, it's a gentle handshake. You have to be humble. She says that to me. She said that to me all the time. You have to be humble. And if you're meeting someone for the first time, you don't want to kick their butt. You want to be humble because we're meeting them. So in Indian country, you're often greeted with a gentle handshake. So those are some nonverbal communications that, again, earlier I said there are no pan-Indians, but you'll often find this is the case when you are in and around Indian country, from eye contact to handshakes, and how people carry and conduct themselves may be a bit different, but don't misconstrue the message or what the conveyance is. So I would caution that. So what else makes Indian country different? Well, we're going to talk about codes and laws. We have our next slide. We have our next polling question. Does the tribe or the tribes you work with incorporate customs and or traditions within their justice system? So if you do have a tribe that incorporates, great. And I'm really interested to know what customs, what traditions. So if you could take, if you wouldn't mind, what are some of the tribes you're working with or you've experienced? How are they incorporating that? When we're talking about tribal codes and laws, tribes have their own constitution. And so this is going to move into our next segment of our presentation, talking about what, now that we know that socially speaking, tribes are different, there is a different sense of justice and things that are going on. Now we're going to talk about how are they relevant? How does this all come to play when we're talking about looking at Indian country justice? So as we're talking about Indian country justice and getting away from the social connotations and looking at this from a legal aspect, I also want to say I'm not going to get too far into the weeds of the legal. I like the weeds, but for the purpose of this presentation, and I think I looked at the list, there may be one or two attorneys on here. If you're interested in anything further that may be in the weeds that I don't cover, either send me a chat or an email. I'll be happy to address this with you. But Indian country is unique because tribes were negotiating treaties long before the establishment of the United States. The first treaty was with the Delaware and France. I think that's also important to note. I personally was the first ambassador to the United Nations for the Muskogee Creek Nation. And if you look at the definitions, we have a land and territory, we have borders, we have a people, a history, a language, all of those things that set us apart, and we are a domestic dependent nation, even being as such. We have constitutions and we have treaty authority. We have treaty authority with, if we wanted to establish a treaty with France for any reason, we have that authority to do so. And the U.S. Constitution does not govern the actions of tribal governments. Now, as a prosecutor, I have told my officers, because in Indian country, and this goes back to our earlier Crow Dog case, in Indian country, for criminal jurisdiction purposes, tribes can only prosecute other tribal members, other members of it. So it has to be an Indian on Indian crime. Now, this gets a little bit to that PL 280 issue. So if you're PL 280, I just want to make that, I'll come back to PL 280 in just a moment. But for the remainder of the tribe, we can and do prosecute Indian crimes on Indian people committed on Indian land. Now, if you are Indian, if you're rolling down the street and you're pulled over by an officer and they happen to ask you, hey, what race are you? I hope you know a good civil rights attorney. In fact, I think I saw somebody with the ACLU, and I think they may give me an amens or a hands out saying, yes, you should not be asked by any law enforcement officer what race you are, as to determine how the laws will impact you. However, if you're in Indian country, guess what? It's going to be significantly different, because that's the very first question they have to find out. Are you Indian? So it kind of trickles down to this. My officers, I have them a little credit card size copy of Miranda, but it's two-sided. On one side, I have Miranda as it reads, and on the other side, I have Indian Miranda. So everybody's familiar with the Miranda. We've got people who watch TV all the time. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Okay? That's basically it. If you're in Indian country and you're Indian, your Miranda will sound like this. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. If you cannot afford an attorney, sucks to be you. You shouldn't have been messing around in Indian country and acting like a ding-dong. Because, the United States Constitution doesn't govern the actions of, that includes the Bill of Rights. However, in 1968, Congress recognized that there was nothing governing the actions of tribes, so they passed the Indian Civil Rights Act. When they passed the Indian Civil Rights Act, they basically cut and paste everything on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to then reflect what's in the Indian Civil Rights Act, with the exception that if you cannot afford an attorney, then too bad, so sad. That is not something that is going to be covered under the Indian Civil Rights Act. Because if you look at the whole purpose behind that, who was going to be paying for it? The federal government. So they did not include that with the Indian Civil Rights Act. Okay, so that's just one of the highlights of being in Indian country and one of the things that you may experience. If you are in a PL 280 jurisdiction, and I had the slide in earlier and I took it out, but there are several states that are part of Public Law 280. Public Law 280 was an act by Congress that basically said that any criminal jurisdiction of the tribe is going to be exercised by the state. So the tribe can exercise civil jurisdiction. They can do divorces. I hope that they're active with their Indian, their ICWA cases, their Indian civil child welfare cases, and anything else that they can, with the exception of criminal jurisdiction. And under those states, with those tribes, the state will exercise that criminal jurisdiction. There is, if we look at the state of Washington is PL 280, the state of Alaska and California, and I believe Wisconsin, and there may be a couple of others. I say that to point out the state of Washington, and back to the Tulalip tribe. Even though the state is PL 280, Tulalip have retroceded their land, which means they took it all back, and they made an agreement with Washington State with the approval of Congress saying that they will exercise all jurisdiction. So they have their own courts, they have their own police departments, and they have their own codes and laws that they will enforce on the Tulalip land. So I hope that's just kind of a quick little rundown on what is PL 280 and how that is impacted in criminal jurisdiction matters. What else makes Indian country unique? The fact that it is complex, and it is covered by a number of race, land issues. The type of criminal activity can determine jurisdiction. And when I say criminal jurisdiction, that's only one type of jurisdiction, because when we're talking about civil jurisdiction, the rules change significantly from who is Indian to the matters that it can and cannot be evaluated or heard in Indian country. So it's a quagmire. That's an easy way to put it. It's a quagmire. It's convoluted. But starting on the basic premises and where do you want to go? Is it a criminal matter? Who committed the crime? Who was the victim? And where did it take place? If you're looking at a civil matter for Indian child welfare in an ICWA case, so if I say ICWA, that's the Indian Child Welfare Act. Under those circumstances, who is a native is significantly different. The tribe may be more than one tribe. And the land issue or where they can exercise could be significantly different as well. So I only point that out because who is Indian and who has jurisdiction will depend on, well, what's going on and what are the factors involved. Okay. All right. I was curious if this has worked. So we're going to talk a little bit, and I'm going to put this in the context because it gets a little bit trickier. Who is Native American, and why is this relevant? Well, until even now, as I mentioned earlier, Indian on Indian crime in Indian country is under the jurisdiction of the tribe. Now, it can also be under the jurisdiction of the federal government, depending on the tribe. The state may or may not exercise that jurisdiction. If you have a non-Indian who commits a crime in Indian country, they should be turned over to that state, county, or jurisdiction. It doesn't always work that well, and in some cases there have been black holes. This goes back to my plea for cross-deputization agreements and collaboration. If we're not talking to each other, then there are black holes, especially if we're looking at sex offenders and people who prey on the vulnerable. Well, we're talking about Indian country. If you have sex traffickers who are looking for vulnerable, then we're looking at a lot of our Indian country people and our children in Indian country. So For the purpose of criminal jurisdiction, who's Indian, who's Native American, and why is this relevant? Well, let's just take a look. I want to introduce these 5 handsome men, and they all appear to be Indian. But I want to point out, on the top left corner, you may recognize Lou Diamond Phillips. Lou Diamond Phillips is a member of the Navajo Nation. So if Mr. Lou Diamond Phillips were acting out at the tribe, would he be considered Indian for federal criminal jurisdiction purposes? And the answer is yes, he would be. He is a member of a federally recognized tribe. Now, underneath him, we see Benjamin Bratt. He is from the Peruvian tribe. I'm just going to leave it at that, from Peru. I actually did a little research on him and found out that his mother was part of the Alcatraz stand-ins of the late 1960s and 1970s. And there are pictures of him at those protests in Alcatraz from the land takeover. Now, if he were acting up in Indian country at a casino and breaking the tribal law, would he be considered Indian for the purpose of federal Indian law? And the answer is no. He would have to be, he looks native, but he is native, but he is not a member of a federally recognized tribe. He's a member of a Peruvian tribe. So although he may be indigenous to somewhere else, he's not a member of a federally recognized tribe. On the top right-hand corner, we see Adam Beach, known for many of his native movies, and he did a great job. I always love his movies. If he were acting up at a casino under those same circumstances, is he Indian for the purpose of federal criminal law? And the answer is no, not in the United States. The Saulteaux tribe is Canadian. So he is a First Nations indigenous man, but in the United States, he would not be considered Indian for the purpose of Indian criminal law. Below him, this goes to show you how long and dedicated I can be to stalking. This is Billy Bratt, and he was one of the vampires in the 1980s movies Lost Boy with Kiefer Sutherland. So that's how dedicated I am to that. He is a member of the Wyandot Nation, and I include him because I'm the prosecutor for the Wyandot Nation. And if anybody happens to know him, I would please ask you to pass along. He needs to go back to the Wyandot powwow this year. Okay, moving on. In the center, we have Mr. Captain Jack Sparrow, Johnny Depp. Johnny Depp, when his recent movie Tonto and Lone Ranger, the remake, came out, he was involved in an adoption ceremony with the Comanche Nation. It was a big deal to do in the town. They gave him a tribal card. He went through a formal ceremony to be part of the tribe. Now, if Johnny Depp were acting up in the casino on Indian land, is he considered Indian for those criminal jurisdiction purposes? The answer is no. He would not. Now, that also goes down to, I shared these with the idea that we're talking about criminal jurisdiction because it differs. So if we look at, and this is a cheat sheet, so if you download this, I want you to make sure that you understand this little cheat sheet here is for criminal jurisdiction purposes, but I share it with you to show how convoluted and how race plays a significant role as who's arrested, who is not arrested, or who is going to do the arresting, just to make sure that we can help keep Indian country safe and we know who are the proper authorities for these matters. So when we're talking about who is Indian, it can vary. Now, I gave you the issues that we're looking at when it comes to federal criminal law and tribal criminal law, but then we have to ask, with relation to the Indian Child Welfare Act. Who's Indian? Well, according to the act will apply to any child who is a member of a federally recognized tribe or who is eligible for enrollment. Now, who is eligible for enrollment? That can mean that your mother is a member of a federally recognized tribe, or your father is a member of a federally recognized tribe. Well, there's a pending court case that is going to ask this, okay? If it passes from your lineage and your grandmother is a member of a federally recognized tribe, but the mother didn't enroll and then she has a baby, is that baby eligible for enrollment? Is that baby Indian for the purpose of the Indian Child Welfare Act? I would argue yes, because if the grandmother is eligible, then the mother is eligible. Because the mother is eligible, therefore the baby is eligible. I would say yes, but I do want to point out that that is a pending court case. I can tell you how I feel, but we'll see how the decision is rendered with respect to that. So when you look at if someone is Indian or if they're eligible for enrollment or citizenship, it's important to look because that is going to go to the tribal constitutions. For the Muskogee Creek Nation, where I am an enrolled member, and I believe this is applicable to the 5 tribes that I talked about earlier, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, the Creek, and the Seminole. Their tribal enrollment and membership is any lineal descendant. So as long as you can, from the Dawes Commission that was in place from about the 1880s to the early 1900s, where Congress sent the Dawes Commission out across the country to survey Indian country and find out who is Indian. They had to get their names on the Dawes rolls. Now, recognizing that time frame from the 1880s to the early 1900s, this was after the Trail of Tears. This was after Crow Dog, or about the time of Crow Dog. There was a lot of distrust, significant distrust, and rightfully so, between the tribes and the federal government. So when the Dawes Commission came to many Native communities and say, hey, we need everybody to line up and we need to get everyone's name, there were a lot of people that said thanks but no thanks. So we have, the carry forward on that is this. We have a lot of Native people who are not members of a federally recognized tribe. They can be identifiably Native, but if their ancestors were not on those Dawes rolls, they are not Indian today. Now, if someone is on the Dawes rolls, my great-grandmother was on the Dawes rolls. She was a young girl when that took place. And when she had children, those children were enrolled. All I have to do is show my birth certificate, my mother's birth certificate, tying myself back to that one name on the Dawes rolls, and therefore that's my membership. Because, again, the Muskogees, by our Constitution, are any lineal descendant. Now, there are several tribes, the Navajo Nation, the Diné Nation, they have a 50% blood quantum. This is where this comes into play. The tribe will set their own blood quantum, and it will be enumerated within their tribal constitution. The Kiowa Nation, who are in Oklahoma, at one time their blood quantum was 1/2. Their tribal population was getting so low, they lowered their blood quantum to 1/4. Every tribe is different, and if the tribes want to recognize an adoption and then take people in, that's up to them. All of that will be within their tribal constitutions, recognizing who legally is a tribal member and how that is carried forward. it's also important to know, and this would also be within the Constitution, whether it's matrilineal or patrilineal. Matrilineal being that everything passes through the mother. I get my tribal identity, my clan is from my mother, any property, and this is kind of carried with some of the laws in the Muskogee Nation, first choice will go to the mother. Many tribes out west of the United States are patrilineal, and there are other tribes who are as well. And so everything there would pass through the father. So I just want to point that out. So if you have questions, if you're working with a tribe, look to their constitution as to what's going to discern who is Indian. And then again, one more time, it's going to depend on why are you asking. Are you asking for criminal purposes or for Indian Child Welfare Act purposes? And the tribe may have some certain, maybe they have a program for full-blood Indians or for half-bloods. So who is Indian? It's going to depend on who's asking. Now, for the U.S. Census, they will ask what is your race, and so for there you don't have to show any tribal membership, any formal tribal affiliation. I have my tribe card, formerly known as my CDIB, my Certified Degree of Indian Blood. So for the census, they will take they will take identified, self-identified people. So that can work for the census. So again, who is Indian? It depends. What is the purpose that you're asking will depend on the answer that you can give. I hope that's not too confusing, and hopefully we can make it through. Now, when we're talking about tribes and tribal justice, we're getting focused more now on, rather than the social and the federal perspective, let's look at things in a local. Let's look at things from a tribal perspective. And what is tribal justice? So as I was putting this together, I thought, when were your tribal laws updated? Now, tribes began forming their own constitutions in the 1960s and 1970s. Again, everything was handled traditionally speaking. We had our oral speakers, and we knew how our government and our tribes worked, but they're now being codified. They're now being put on paper. So in the 1980s, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA, had a template of about maybe 15 to 20 laws, and they passed around this template. Every tribe could fill in their name. This is a code of criminal laws for the Kickapoo tribe, for the Muskogee Creek Nation. And they basically filled it in, and there they were. Now, the question is, have those been updated with the tribe? And so, have tribes updated their codes since the 1980s when that was initiated? I say this, and I put these topics on here, and I'm just curious. This isn't a polling question, but I mean, I'm always curious. What was the last law that you're familiar with that your tribe has passed that affects children and families? I remember just a couple of years ago, we had to pass car seats for infants and for children. Because I'm a prosecutor, we're always looking at technology-facilitated crimes. So that would be anything with a computer, with a cell phone, somebody doing manufacturing, distributing, or possessing child porn, bullying. In many states, they have those laws. And how about us? Stalking and online stalking. Is that a law? How about voyeuristic video? I put voyeuristic video because I heard about it this morning. Airbnb is charging some of their hosts because they're finding hidden cameras and hidden cell phones that are taking video and pictures of people while they are either in their bedrooms or in the bathroom, and they're being charged by the state for conducting voyeuristic video, which is against the law because they passed that law. But I asked that to you, what is the latest law? Now, I also, one of the big hot topics that's being talked about is human trafficking. So a lot of our tribal professionals are attending conferences and training on how to be on the lookout for commercial sex trafficking, for human trafficking involving kids, involving adults for that matter. But my question is this: if you don't have a law saying that it's illegal, what law are they breaking? Our laws can be enforced only to the effect that they are written to be enforced. So this is my little soapbox that that please, if you have the ear of your administration, please encourage them to look at the tribal codes. Technology facilitated crime, that will include anything that would be on child porn, anything that involves cell phones, iPads, any computers, anything of that nature, voyeuristic video. We're only as strong as we are the laws that we can protect our people. That also came true with the National Sex Offenders Registry. We had all kinds of people moving into Indian country, into Indian housing, living side by side. They didn't have to register with the state. They didn't have to register with the feds. So they moved to Indian country, so they didn't have to register. But the Sex Offender National Registry changed that. So now, if any sex offender moves into Indian country is included as that third jurisdictional promise. That if you're in a state or a tribe or tribal territory or in a federal jurisdiction, you have to give notice. Okay. A question, I'm just looking at, how do you think the new criminal law cases currently being litigated in Oklahoma will affect tribal laws in Oklahoma? Miss Allison, let me say this. If I had a crystal ball, I would sure be rubbing it right now. Oklahoma has a pending criminal matter. We had a gentleman on death row, is putting it nicely. We had a guy on death row who was convicted of a grisly homicide. And right before he was to be executed, he said, wait, I'm Indian. And matter of fact, he had some great attorneys that did their homework, and they argue that the land where this homicide took place was in fact Indian country and not state land, because the state of Oklahoma had him on death row. That is being litigated. I don't know. I know how I want it to go. I'm kind of hesitant to say anything one way or another. I know we have some meetings coming up that could have a significant impact on what we're talking about with criminal law. So great question. I wish I had an answer. I think that we'll just have to give it a little bit of time and see what happens. Okay. We polled this a little bit earlier, but I'm always curious. Are there traditional rules and customs reflected in the tribal codes and laws? Now, I think the poll showed that some of you said that there are somewhat some of the tribal customs that are reflected in the laws. And in many of my tribes and courts where I work, they are not. And I say that, and I included these couple of caveats. Recognizing that Indians became citizens in 1924. The Indian Religious Freedom Act was enacted in 1978. We had boarding schools. There have been a number of laws and congressional acts and state laws and state acts that have basically outlawed being Indian without outlawing being Indian. So our language, our religion, our customs and practices have often at one point in time been outlawed. So I understand that they are not reflected or easily reflected in our tribal codes and laws. Also remembering that we're oral people, and our histories are oral and they're passed down that way. But I think it's also important for us to codify them. They need to be written. With each passing generation of elders, we are also losing a lot of that information. So I implore those who are working with tribes and with tribal justice systems to bring in as many and incorporate as many of the tribal codes and customs as possible. As a tribal prosecutor, I think that that was one of the things that I felt was most important. Through the Major Crimes Act, they limit the maximum sentence of jail and or fine. Now, as a tribal prosecutor, I prosecute everything from homicide to bad checks and traffic tickets. Now, the question is this. If I try someone for homicide, anyone, and you can throw it in the chat, anyone know what is the maximum sentence as a tribal prosecutor in tribal court, and I'm trying someone for homicide and I get a conviction, what is the maximum sentence I can ask, no, the court can impose upon that convicted defendant or that convicted person? The answer is 1 year in jail and or $3,000. Oh, I'm sorry, 1 year in jail and or $5,000. With the passage of the Tribal Law and Order Act of 2010, it has been extended to, for some tribes, for 3 years and or $15,000. For those of us who work with justice and are dealing with homicide, rape, assault, 1 year, or even 3 years for that matter, is significantly underwhelming. So that's where it relies on our partners to bring these things up. Now, looking at the Major Crimes Act, the Major Crimes Act was also a proponent of 1 year. Tribes can only sentence a maximum of 1 year and or $5,000. But if we look at this in a tribal perspective, jail is not traditional. Fine upon someone is not traditional. What is important, and when we had, kids acting out, tearing things up, or just being kids, that is not new. We had traditional ways of addressing these. So what are they? I think that tribes are sitting on our own indigenous resources. And until we tap those elders and we find out what did tribes used to do when kids acted out, or if someone was violent with someone else, what did they used to do? I think it's upon us to tap into those indigenous elders, into our resources that we're sitting on fawn. Now, they're going to be unique to each tribe. They're like a tribal prescription. I think that's where our responsibility as practitioners is to find out what is that prescription. What that can do is open a plethora of resources that we're sitting upon. But we're sitting upon those, and the knowledge is with the elders, and I think it's important for us to go to those elders and find out what those laws and things are. Now, let me back it up. What is the process for passing new laws with the tribe? There can be a formal process. We have tribal governing bodies, congresses. We have tribal business committees. They have their formal process. I use, when I tried to pass car seats, I put it on the agenda, and when the matter came up, we had about 200 tribal members, and I stood up and said, hey, I would like to pass this law for tribal car seats, and because I think that it's important that we protect our children. And I thought that was a no-brainer, and it was voted down unanimously. I was disheartened. I thought I could help improve the health, safety, and welfare of the children. And when I got to the elders after the meeting, I said, well, why did no one vote for this? I thought this is a good thing. And the elder told me, you didn't ask us. So the important message I got from there was, it's important to poll the community. So I held a community gathering. We had food for the community members. We had balloons and activities. And I asked the community, what is important to you? I asked the tribal community, what laws do you feel are important? Well, they did come up with child car seats, but they also came up with 3 more that I had overlooked. So it's important to know what does the tribe want? What do the people in the community want? That's the best way I have found in getting something passed, because it needs to reflect the tribe. It needs to reflect that community. So that's why I put it under the bullet. That's how to get things done. It's not by doing it my way. It's by doing it in a way that is appropriate for them. All right, some other suggested practices. Establish rapport with the cultural leaders. I think that that's important. And the cultural leaders are going to be significantly different from political leaders. And we've got our next question. Is there a cultural leader or elder within the tribal community you can approach with custom or tradition questions? This is also a way to learn about indigenous resources and practices. I would say get that information from the people. Don't Google it. If you have those resources there, find out from them what are their stories, what are their histories. And the incorporation of these into of the ceremonies into your healing practices of family reunifications, of different things such as that. I also recommend to tribes, especially with court, use their language. What is the word for judge? Use it. Put it on a placard and put it in front of the judge. What is the word for prosecutor? What is the word for defendant? How about jury? In many cases, a lot of our court language is Latin. So be a translator. Take it from Latin to Kickapoo. Take it from Latin to Creek. We need to interpret that so that there is tribal buy-in. They recognize their words. They recognize what it is. What is your family code? It should be what is the children's code. What is that language? Put it in the codes and use it. Now, it may be something simple as calling it the children codes, or I think the Lakota call it the Talanska. I know I'm saying that wrong, but they incorporate a lot of, their code isn't the children's code or the family code. They use their tribal language for naming that code. And everyone else, when referring to it, they have to use that as well. Okay. And be prepared. Another suggested practice, ask. Ask other tribes, what are they doing? I think I see another here where there's a recommended, the Cherokee Nation Code is under there. Take a look at them. How are they including these? Where appropriate, if you have ceremonies, if you have a dinner or something, be inclusive of state and federal partners if you feel that that is appropriate. And be prepared to serve tribal people wherever they are. I want to share with you the Native American Children's Alliance, my organization. I know there's so much to cover, and we have only a certain amount of time. Please don't hesitate to email or contact me if I can. I want to be the first to tell you thank you. I think that's often overlooked in our practice. For everything that you do, for answering the call at 2 o'clock in the morning if children or families are in need, for all the ugly things that you've seen and you've put up to help a family and to help a child, I want to be there to say thank you. And if in any way possible, if I can be a resource for you in your profession as you're working with Native people and tribal communities, if there's anything I can do to assist, please let me know. I appreciate your time. And as we're talking about things that are so complex and very hard to understand, what we're going to go to is a video. And I think that at the end of the day, I really appreciate this video. We talk about things that are dark, and we talk about things that are hard to handle, hard to deal with. But I want you to take care of yourselves, and I want to leave you with this video that I think is hopeful and inspiring and reminds us why we're doing what we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geri. And so for folks who are listening in through their telephone audio, the video audio is actually played through your computer speakers. So what you'll want to do if you're on the phone is either hang up the phone or put down your phone and turn up your computer speakers and turn those on and up, the quality of the video and how it will play in the webinar room really has to do with your individual bandwidth and internet speed. So we've also put the link to where you can view this video up in the top right-hand corner if for any reason it doesn't work for you. And throughout the video, you can use the chat, and we'll still be here, and Geri can still be here to answer questions through the chat. But thank you all so much for your time today. I'm going to go ahead and start the video now. So if you want to turn your computer volume and speakers on and up, that would be great.
One morning I woke up and I heard my brother crying. He was screaming so loud you thought someone was dying. "Mom, Dad," he screamed, but there was no use trying. They weren't around. I ran outside and saw he'd had a pretty bad crash. His bike was in the ditch, down his arm a bloody gash. He looked so pitiful, just sitting there in the dirt amongst the trash, crying, "I want Mom and Dad." I picked him up and started running toward my uncle's up the way. It started raining and got real dark. He could barely tell it was day. My brother cried and asked, "Sister, where's Mom?" I didn't know what to say, when the truth is, I don't know. When my uncle saw us coming, he ran into the yard. He took my brother from me and he held him in his arms. When he saw my face, I could tell he was alarmed. And he said, "What happened? Did you fall too?" "Uncle, I'm so tired of wondering why. Why do they drink? Why do they do drugs? Why do they leave us? Why?" He said, "Sister, it's hard to explain." And I said, "Uncle, try." And then he told this story.
Once this land was teepees as far as you can see. The water was clean, the land pristine. We were where we were meant to be. Then strangers came across the sea and brought with them their disease. Our people cried and prayed and sang, but it brought them to their knees.
We will rise up from the darkness. We will overcome the pain. Warrior spirits live within us. We shall remain.
Imagine that your family, and most of all your tribe, what if most of everyone you love suddenly got sick and died? And before you even had a chance to bury them and mourn, the strangers came and took away the land where you were born. And you wondered if your parents even cared as they stole you and your brother away, or if they'd been so beaten down they had nothing left to say. And then at school, they cut your hair and beat you if you spoke the language that Creator gave our people when earth awoke.
We will rise up from the darkness. We will overcome the pain. Warrior spirits live within us. We shall remain.
Sister, I'm not trying to tell you that your mom and dad are okay, or that they are not responsible for the choices that they've made. But you see this bloody wound on your little brother's arm. If we don't clean it, it won't heal, and it'll do all kinds of harm. Those deep wounds of our ancestors still bleed within our hearts. When we remember all they've done, that's where the healing starts. So every morning when you wake, you pray this prayer out loud. Creator, help me live in a way that would make my ancestors proud.
We
perseverance is the key.
Warrior spirits live within
Strength,
us.
dignity, honor, that's all in your family tree. So hold your head up high and know that.
We shall remain. We will rise up from the darkness.
Creator, help me live in a way that will make my ancestors proud.
We will overcome the pain.
Creator, help me live in a way that will make my ancestors proud.
Warrior spirits live within us.
Creator, help me live in a way that will make my ancestors proud.
We shall remain.
Little brother, we will rise up from this darkness. Little brother, we will overcome the pain. Remember, warrior spirits live within us. We shall remain.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you again, Geri. I hope you all have a beautiful remainder of your day, and I'll be in touch soon when the recording is posted to the TIE. Thank you.